Fate, Souls and Singularities by author Mundatorem. Chapter 309-310. Singularity 5, Ta Ine Amaric. 7. Meeting the team. It was nearly a full hour before Ash moved on from standing beside Cu Chalain. In that time, neither of them had spoken. He was comfortable with the silence and with the lack of response from the other servant as well. Yet time had passed and he felt it best to move on. Especially as he came to realize that Gina still had yet to return from her trip with Robin Hood. Ash held a low opinion of the man and little had been done to improve it. He walked across the deck, approaching the door that led to the stairwell in the hull below. He could still feel the archer's presence down there, which meant they had not moved anywhere else, but he had not thought it to take quite so long as this. Under his helmet, his eyes narrowed. For a moment, he dared to imagine that Robin could be trying to indoctrinate the young girl with his own beliefs. That he would take the chance to spread his own series of events about what he did and why it was necessary. Ash frowned. Then he stopped as he reached the door, laying his hand upon it and waiting for a few seconds. No, he decided, and pulled the door open and moved down the steps. He reached the bottom and turned his head towards the dim lighting at the far corner of the hold. He could easily make out the shapes further down. One large and the other small, they were huddled near one of the crates and with the larger one rummaging around with a few grunts and groans. He advanced, his steps echoing as he moved. The head of Robin turned to look at him, briefly. Ash caught a frown before the head turned back and resumed searching through the box. The rest of the body was crowded over, hands moving around and the clatter and scraping of something moving around inside it. He stopped and looked down, his eyes turning on Gina as she looked up at him with a far less filthy face than she had before she came down, though he could still see the specks of dried mud and the hard clumps which matted her hair together in some parts. The girl, still with her toy clutched in her hand, stared silently back at him. "You were gone for some time," Ash said, looking back to Robin. "I was concerned." Robin stopped moving, then he moved slowly and steadily. His head climbed back from the box, and he turned his body around, staring at Ash with an expression of mounting surprise and suspicion. Then it blended away to incredulity. "Really?" he said, drawing out the word and stretching it with disbelief. Ash frowned, his eyes narrowing. The doubt was surprising and also misplaced. "Yes," he said, "really. Can't imagine myself being any more dangerous than the guy teaching her to stab people up." Ash cocked his head. "And what about the man who was a criminal and bandit for most of his life?" Robin sighed and looked away, returning his attention to the box and resuming his looting of whatever was inside. "Is that what this is about?" Robin said, his voice came out as tired and worn down. "What else would it be about?" Ash asked, bringing his arms up and folding them over his chest. He found the idea that it could be about anything else to be rather strange, and the lack of awareness was startling to him. More so that Robin himself found the topic to be almost an afterthought or some sort of nuisance. Ash was rather different in that regard and considered it to be far more important. Especially with young and impressionable minds. Gina looked between them cautiously, her eyes narrowing and her face scrunching up in thought. It was becoming increasingly clear that the girl was rather adept at observation or held enough sense to pick up on the rising tension between them. "If there is no further reason for her to be here," Ash took a step forwards, "then we shall return to the deck above." Robin let out a soft grunt, turning and facing Ash with one hand still on the box. "I didn't say I was finished yet. She still needs something better than those dirty rags to wear, and we have some supplies in here." Ash nodded. "You are free to resume searching, but she will be returning with me to the main deck where I can keep an eye on her." Robin's eyes narrowed. "And why are you qualified to do that?" "Because I do not have a history of engaging in criminal acts that could be easily passed on." Ash closed the final step and dropped his hand onto Gina's shoulder. She stiffened at his grip and gave a light move to push herself away, but he held firm. Between the two of them, he was much stronger and her protests themselves were rather half-hearted. It was, perhaps, a sort of feeble shove to try and get him to let her walk on her own. Robin Hood glowered at him. "You're not proving yourself very. If I wanted your opinion," Ash said, giving the man a hard look, "I would have asked for it. You said it yourself, I am a criminal. Robin smiled, so why should I care what you have to say? Ash said nothing, he only stared at the man for several long seconds. Robin smirked at him, a flash of smug triumph came over his face. Is this where you tell me you were also some paragon of justice and law as well, and that every deed you ever committed was fully just and lawful? Ash frowned, not that he could see, and turned himself away. Unwilling to be drawn into the argument, he started to walk away, pulling Gina along with him as he did so. The girl scrambled beside him as she struggled to keep up, grunting and gasping before giving a heaving tug and then groaning with frustration. At the foot of the steps, he stopped and cast a long look down at her. What? He asked. Gina frowned and tugged at him again, the frown deepened the longer she pulled. Then, with a final and failing pull, she stomped her foot and glowered at him, puffing out her cheeks and curling her small hands into tightly bound fists. I can walk by myself, she said, growling every word. Ash raised a brow. You do not walk as swiftly as I do. Her eyes narrowed. I can. Slowly, he tilted his head and stared at her. For a moment, he could have sworn he heard a note of challenge in her voice or at least an indignation about what he had said. Yet he could not quite understand why that would be. She would surely have been intelligent enough to realize how outclassed she would have been if they were to compare speeds. So he shook his head and looked back up the steps. In a few seconds, they were moving again. Gina let out a grunt of annoyance and frustration. I said, I heard you the first time. Ash cut her short. He was well aware that she could walk by herself, and that was not what he was concerned about. So, lowering his hand down, he slung it around her waist and pulled her up. Gina let out a short and cut-off shout of surprise and shock as he hefted her up and effortlessly carried her the length of the stairs right to the top. Throwing the door open, he walked out onto the deck and then set her back down without another word. The girl stumbled as her feet made contact with the deck, yanking herself away sharply and very nearly throwing herself down to the ground. Ash made no move to correct her and simply watched in silence. Gina abruptly sprung to life the second she found her balance, whirling around with a tight scowl stretching across her lips and with her hand flying up and balled into a tight fist. There was a dull thunk and then she gasped in pain, pulling her hand back and cupping it with her other. Her posture bent over and hugging her left hand tightly against her chest. While that was happening, Ash remained totally silent, staring down at her with wide and puzzled eyes as she tried to nurse her bruised hand against her chest and sniffling. Ash had been caught totally by surprise by the punch, so he had remained stiff and unmoving for several long seconds. During that time, Gina had started to fight back tears. He could hear them easily with the muffled whimpers and the slight whine in her throat as she turned away and pressed the hand tighter to her chest. He stepped forwards and reached across, pushing his fingers past her feeble hold and closing them around her wrist. He gave her a soft pull and pried the hand away from her, putting it under the moonlight and letting him see it. The skin around her knuckles was already red. He could see the pattern of the chainmail forced into the skin. Apparently she had struck him rather hard and without much hesitation, except now she was suffering for it. Ash frowned. Careless and pointless, he grunted, dropping himself down into a crouch and staring at the limb. Gina only sniffled as a reply. He turned his head and looked at her face. The tears were running down her cheeks and she was forcing her lips to roll inwards, muffling the whimpers and the whining that would have otherwise spilled forth as her bawling her eyes out. Ash supposed he would be thankful for her control, but he would have been far more grateful if she had the sense to not attempt it in the first place. Still, he thought with a shake of the head, what was done was done. Yet, staring down at the bruised knuckles and the crying face of the girl, Ash was surprised to find himself rather annoyed at her. She had been stupid, he thought. Stupid and careless, and he would be well within his rights to leave her to her misery because of it. It was one of the only ways she would learn to be smarter in the future and to not punch someone with armor plating. It was how he had learned. Then he stopped and frowned, turning his head a few degrees away from her and almost forgetting she was even there. Instead, Ash found himself drawn back to a conversation over an hour ago with Ritska and himself. For a few short seconds, he let the conversation play out in his mind. Then he frowned and looked back at the knuckles. With a sigh, he raised his left hand and closed it into a fist, his eyes followed suit as he held himself still. He was not wholly familiar with performing miracles, and he suspected that it was due to his lack of faith as well. It was only because of who his mother was, and how powerful she could perform such things, that he believed he could even cast them without the use of a talisman, but he still lacked the faith and the belief in them. But for a few bruises, he decided that it was enough. His eyes opened to the dimming golden light spreading out from under his feet. The sudden burst of yellow had brought the attention of the girl straight down, her eyes widening under the glow and her shadow cast out in all directions over the deck. As the glow faded, so too did the glistening reflection of her tear-struck face. She looked back to her knuckles with sudden and rather alarmed confusion, blinking slowly as he released her hand and stood back up. He moved away from her and folded his arms, watching as she started to bend her fingers up and down, flexing them slowly. Then she started to prod and poke at the clear skin, wincing for a second before she poked again and made no reaction, clearly astounded at the fact she was not feeling the pain she had expected to find. Her eyes swung towards him, blown wide with amazement and shock. Apparently, whatever anger she held towards him had been forgotten at that moment. "It doesn't hurt," she said, her voice still thick with the surprise, even as the seconds had ticked past. "Yes," Ash said, nodding. "That is the point." Gina looked down at her hand again. "Why?" "Because I healed it." Once again, she was staring up at him, though now she looked more curious than surprised or worried. "How?" Ash stared at her, feeling a mild sense of puzzlement. Once again, he thought she would have accepted his initial answer and gone no further. Apparently, she was simply more inquisitive than he first anticipated. "It does not matter," Ash said, shaking his head. His arm lowered and pointed to her own. "You are better now, and that is all you should care about." Gina, once more, stared at her hand. It was strange, he thought, that she was so puzzled by the sight of her hand being healed in such a way when he was far more accustomed to that method of healing than any other. The instant recovery of wounds and cuts compared with the drawn-out process of the people of this world was strange to him, though their medical knowledge was far superior. He turned and grabbed her shoulder again, leading her along as she kept pace with him. It was a short walk to the other side of the deck, and this time Gina was silent. A brief glance every few steps showed that she was still gazing at her hand, now bringing her other to poke and prod at it, pulling at the knuckles and pinching the skin, scrutinizing it deeply. Searching for any sign of the old injury, he considered. And then they stopped. He put her a few steps ahead and then stood with his arms folded, gazing out across the dark sky and the stars above. Gina turned, looking first to him and then looking up towards the night sky. There was a short pause. "Oh," she said, her voice was small and worried. "I should be asleep." Ash looked down at her. "Do you feel tired?" Gina silently shook her head. "Then why would you need to sleep?" She frowned. "Because Daddy tells me to sleep before dark." HMPH. Ash grunted. "If you do not feel tired, then how would you be able to sleep?" Gina went silent again, her eyes scrunched up with thought and her arms raising up and folding tightly over her chest. With her brows tightly pulled together and her arms neatly folded, the girl looked more like an old scholar lost in thought for some deeply complex question, her mouth opened and closed in a silent conversation with her own thoughts. Gradually, she started to widen her eyes and the movements of her mouth slowed. Then she looked to him and shrugged her shoulders. "I don't know." Ash grunted, his head cocked. After all that, he thought dryly, and shook his head. "If you aren't tired, then there is no point in sleeping," he said. Gina frowned. Apparently she didn't like that at all. "But, Daddy will be upset with me," she said. She shuffled backwards and forwards, rocking on the balls of her feet. Her eyes, sharp and worried, moved around as they glanced back and forth, as if she expected her father to suddenly appear and whisk her away to her bed or to punish her for not doing what he told her. Instead, there was only nothing but the gentle breeze of the night air and the muffled conversations from across the deck. Ash stared at her for a moment, then he spoke. "I do not believe your father is in much of a position to care about what you do and do not do for him now." Gina stilled, her eyes widening. There was a short pause from her, and then she ducked her head and started to whimper. He sighed softly to himself, turning his head and raising a hand. The tips of his finger raked back and forth across the dome of his helm, making an irregular grinding noise as they moved over the rough and jagged surface of the helmet. "Do you want to sleep?" he asked instead, pulling the hand away and looking at her again. For a few moments, it looked to him that she would not respond. Her head still lowered down and her whimpers barely audible, she balled her hands together again and held them in front of herself. In between them both was the small wooden carving of the mule. She was staring at that as she cried. "I want mommy," she murmured with a watery voice. Ash felt his body twitch, just slightly, at her words. It was not the tone, but the contents. "That is not what I asked," he said stiffly. Gina paid him no heed, her sniffles growing louder as her hands and arms brought themselves upwards, rubbing at her face and wiping away the tears. Her arms were streamed with long wet marks and her nose bubbled as she sniffled, her lips curling down into a grimace. "I want to sleep with mommy," Gina gurgled. "You can't," Ash said, unsure of how else to explain the situation to her. It had been done before and he had made sure it was done, yet she persisted on it. He frowned and turned himself away, folding his arms over his chest. He felt frustrated and a little annoyed. Her pleading for her dead mother was rather grating to him as it would likely last with her for the rest of her life, or at least the rest of her time here. He did not know if that would be of any comfort if events reset when they left or if they would continue as they were under some other cause. Nor did he find himself caring beyond that. Instead he was left standing here with a crying girl. If it was truly the matter of a mother figure, or at least a woman that could serve as a female figure of authority, then he supposed another could be found. There were some in Chaldea, but bringing them down solely for the purpose of watching the girl seemed like a waste of time and effort. Her mother was dead and the sooner she accepted it the better. The same with her father. Then Ash was drawn back again to the conversation with Ritska and the contents of it. The looks that he had received. He turned his head, slow and steady, and moved it across the deck. His eyes narrowed in the dark and he quickly found the heads facing him, the distant looks from those who were watching intently. Even as some of them moved and worked, they were watching. Not simply those who worked, but those who were standing perfectly still. His eyes drew to a stop at Bedrick, his face masked behind the helmet he wore. Yet his arms were folded tightly over his chest, his shoulders raised and his posture tense. There was almost a physical wave of disapproval sent across the deck as the two locked eyes, at least he felt them lock eyes. The sensation couldn't have been anything but. Bedrick, apparently, was watching and found what he was watching distasteful. But then what did it matter what he thought? Ash grunted to himself in near silence. He turned back to Gina and lowered himself down into a crouch, one hand resting on his knee while the other was by his side. He said nothing to her as he came to a stop, merely watching as he cried to herself and sniffled every few moments. He expected it to last for another few seconds, but it continued on even past that. Her state was pitiful, he thought to himself bitterly, and rather sad as well. More than anything else, he just wished that she would stop crying and find another thing to do. He frowned to himself all the deeper at the lack of thoughts that came to him, yet he didn't want to go out and find someone else to deal with it. He knew it would still be there, even if he wasn't the one staring at her. It bothered him deeply. It also inflamed something in him. Something old and sickly. The pleading for a mother. Ash felt his jaw tighten, his teeth grinding against one another back and forth. "Sit," he said, pointing down to the deck. Gina blinked at him, rubbing her eyes again as the tears continued to fall. They glinted under the moonlight as they streamed down her face and onto her muddy clothes. He was sure that by now, Ritska would have expected something done about the state she was in. He did not know how best to deal with the problems with her hair beyond cutting out the matted clumps, and he decided that it would probably be the best solution. "Wah." Gina slurred her words, still gurgling with unshed tears. Ash frowned at her lack of prompt responses. "Sit down," he said again, "and put your back to me." "Why?" she asked, her voice a little bit louder. "Because I said so." Gina gave a soft and irritable grumble, but she still turned around and lowered herself down to the ground very slowly. Sitting cross-legged on the deck and then groaning once again. She huffed and just barely, he could make out her muttered voice. "This hurts," she complained. "It will not be for long," Ash replied, taking out a short knife from his box and eyeing it. The edge was sharp and well treated, designed for slashing and cutting. It would work well enough for removing the dried patches of hair, though it would still need to be washed and her clothes changed. He brought up his hand and placed it atop his head, moving his other about as his fingers found the first large lump of dried mud. Easing the knife forwards, he slashed quickly at the roots of the hair and gave a quick tug when he was done. In a matter of seconds, there was a small mass of dried mud with strands of hair jutting free of it. He could also see the original color of the hair, once concealed under the layer of mud. It was a light brown, bordering near the color of autumn leaves. He dropped it to the ground with a quiet thud and moved on to the next one. Gina shuffled. "Don't move," he ordered, narrowing his eyes and raising his voice to a stern tone. She stopped, but then she called back over her shoulder. "What are you doing?" "Cutting the mud from your hair," Ash said. He gave another quick slice and pulled more of the mud free. Gina made a soft noise of acknowledgement. "Oh." He pulled again, tugging at the hair. "Ouch," she said, "that hurt." "You'll live," Ash replied blandly and gave another pull of the hair. It came free with another deft movement of the knife and he tossed aside the patch of mud over the side of the ship, hurling it away. Gina shifted again. He had to stop when she moved and frowned at her. She didn't listen well to instructions when she did not want to, it seemed. "Will you hold still?" he said. "But it hurts." She whined again, "and it's cold." "Sitting down hurts too." "It will be for only a couple more minutes," Ash said and personally doubted it would even take that long. There was the soft thump of approaching footsteps. He turned his eyes slightly to the right and saw that Shiki had approached while he worked. She now stood about 2 or 3 feet ahead of them and off to the side. The sudden appearance had Gina turn her head again, looking up at her. Ash closed his eyes, feeling his patience draw thin. He opened them again and placed his hand around the top of the girl's head, giving it a slow turn until it was pointed directly away from him. Holding it there for a few moments, he moved his hand back down through the hair into the last of the large masses of grime, pulling it forwards and slipping the knife down again. Shiki watched them, saying nothing and doing nothing. She merely stood there, hands in the pockets of her red coat and her eyes narrowed slightly. Then she cocked her head slightly to one side. "You ever done this before?" she asked. "No," Ash said, pulling away the final cut locks of old hair and throwing them off the side of the ship. They vanished without a trace. He lowered his hand down and slowly stood back up, slipping the knife away and staring down at his work. Gina's hair was jagged now, mismatched in places. Some parts were long and went down to her shoulders, others stopped around her ear. The little girl's hands moved upwards, pawing slowly at the hair and the short patches, then she turned around and looked at him. Her eyes wide and her bottom lip quivering slightly. She looked sad. "What?" Ash snapped, frowning down at her. "The mud is gone." Gina sniffled again, louder. "My hair." Ash folded his arms. "Yes. I cut parts of it off." Gina turned away from him, now looking to Shiki. "Is it bad?" Shiki said nothing, squinting down at the girl for a few seconds. Then she nodded her head. "Yes," she said, her voice blunt and her tone curt. "It is." Gina stared, her eyes wide. Then the tears rolled down her cheeks again, her head ducked low and her knees rose up. She wedged her head between her knees and bawled into them, the sound muffled by the legs but still loud enough to echo across the ship. He felt his frown vanish as the noise continued. She seemed to cry a lot, he thought. Thinking back to his own time when he was her age and thought of how often he cried. He remembered it being cold and wet. He remembered his father, looming over him with sword in hand. Most of all he remembered the bruises and the beatings, the broken bones and the large slashes over his body. The groans of pain and the long seconds of lying down on the ground and staring at his own blood. He remembered the glow of his mother's eyes and the softness of her face, the slight twitch of her lips when he lasted longer every time. Then he remembered the glow of her miracles and the pain being little more than a distant memory. He had cried sometimes until he stopped, from then it had been only groans of pain and grunts of agony. Until he no longer recalled a time when he would weep or even acknowledge the pain to his body. Looking down now at the girl crying to herself over some cuts of hair was odd, he thought. In the corner of his eye, he could see Shiki move slightly. Her hands climbed out of her pockets and they came to rest around herself, folding her arms loosely over her chest and bringing down her lips into a small but still noticeable frown. What? Ash asked again. The annoyance was still present but now he felt confusion. The mud was gone, he thought, and therefore the problem of her hair could be more easily solved without having to worry about easing away the grime or hurting the girl when it was cleaned. The hair would grow back and all would be well in time, or it would not even matter. Shiki looked to him, her face was difficult to read. The expressionless mask remained on him, then she shrugged. Some girls care about their hair, she said, her hand raised and played with her own, looping the dark locks around her finger twice before pulling back and letting it drop back to her. Ash didn't quite understand. She still has hair, he said, gesturing to her. So then what is the rhythmic thumping of footsteps on wood had him stop and fall silent, his words trailing into nothing. The sound was growing louder and closer to him. He guessed it would be upon him in perhaps 2 or 3 seconds. Ash turned his head and caught sight of them quickly. Rapidly approaching him at a brisk pace was both Ritska and Mash. The former closer to the latter and with a more easily readable expression. There was a growing shock over his face, his eyes were gradually widening and his mouth opening up. Mash's attention was not on him, but instead aimed towards his left and slightly down. Right on Gina. Similarly, she had a slightly widened eye and her pace faltered for a few steps before it resumed. Behind them was another servant, standing near enough the same height as Ritska and wearing a dark coat with a pale brown waistcoat underneath, his wide-brimmed hat concealing some of his expression. The servant moved with a slight clink of metal, the small spokes at the back of his leather-brown shoes brought a slight echo to his steps. His expression was one of bemusement, quickly bordering into shock and then a muffled smile. In a few more steps, they were right beside him. Ritska stared down, his eyes still wide and his mouth closed sharply with an audible click. Then he swung the head up and stared at Ash. It was a stare that lasted 3 or 4 seconds. During that time it was not only Ritska that was silent, but also the others who had approached with him. Their attention alternated between him and then to the girl quietly crying down on the deck, still with strands of loose hair surrounding her and tightly clenching the wooden doll. Bringing a fist to cover his mouth, Ritska stared down with an expression that could only be described as deep thought. Then he pulled the fist back just enough to avoid muffling his words and asked, "So what were you trying to do?" "I cut her hair," Ash said, stating what he thought to be the obvious. He made a short gesture to the girl, frowning under his helmet as he did so. "I made do with the equipment I had and you cut her hair." Ritska blinked slowly, looking over Gina rather intently, and then slowly twitching his face into a near cringe. "I cut her hair," he repeated, though she had. "With what? A knife?" "Yes." Behind Ritska, the blonde servant snorted and raised a fist to his mouth, coughing into it and being able to conceal the rest of the laughter which he had initially failed to. Ritska turned to him for a few seconds, then turned back around and stared at Gina. Well, Ritska let out a breath, dropping his hands onto his hips and staring for another few seconds. "I'm not sure your career as a hairdresser is off to a flying start, but at least you got the mud out." Even to Ash, it sounded as though Ritska was trying to sound as though he was searching for an optimistic take. The words had the effect of intensifying the whimpers and sniffles. He glanced down and saw that Gina had grown more disheartened. Her shoulders slumped and she very nearly dropped onto the ground, her body hunched forwards in a curve. Ritska turned, lowering himself down to the level of the girl and speaking to her in a soft and gentle voice. "I'm going to get someone down here to help, all right Gina? You'll have your hair back in no time, and you'll also be clean as well." He stood back up, sending Ash an exasperated look. We could have gotten you some scissors if you wanted to cut her hair, you know. Ash did not respond. He looked between the two of them, feeling the confusion and frustration rise again with him. This was exactly the sort of scenario he had been trying to avoid in the first place. The pointless waste of time that would come in dragging down a servant solely so they could tend to a single girl and then sending them back on their way. Gina, rather predictably, barely acknowledged the words and continued to cry and whine. Ritska sighed, turning his head and taking a short step away, his hands fiddling with the communicator on his wrist as a screen flashed up. He moved a few more steps away, enough that the conversation that followed was not immediately audible. Even if it was, the blonde servant approached and placed his hands on his hips, moving between him and Ritska all while looking down at the girl. "Well, at least you left some of her hair," he said, nodding slowly. Ash frowned. "I removed the most damaged parts of it." "Yeah." The voice was strained, still trembling as laughter was forced out of the words. They looked rather amused, Ash thought, and the corner of their lip kept twitching upwards every few moments. Eventually the man turned his head and looked away. Raising a hand and rubbing it across their jaw, he stared at Ash for a few seconds before he spoke again. "So that was your first time doing it, huh?" "It was," Ash said. "I never had a need to do it before." Mash spoke next. "I think you would have done better with some scissors," she said, eyeing the girl with a clear level of pity. "And a comb." Ash looked at her. "Do you have those?" Mash frowned and then shook her head. "Not on me at the moment, no." She was silent for a moment longer, her eyes narrowing slightly. Then they widened and she raised her right hand to her own hair, pulling at it and staring down, her gaze flicking back and forth. Then she smiled. "She could get hair like mine." Ash took another moment to gaze at Gina. He looked past her crying face and towards her hair. The chestnut brown strands were short in some places, too short for what Mash was offering. He had a clearer idea of how it looked, having been the one to do it. He folded his arms and then shrugged. "Her hair is closer to mine than yours," he said. In the corner of his eye, there was a flash of light. Then, as the light vanished, there was a new person standing there with her hood pulled back and down. Long violet-colored hair flowed past pointed ears. The woman turned and looked around, her deep purple lips tugged into a sharp and irritable frown. "I cannot say whether to be offended or amused that you would call me down for this, rather than Atalanta," Medea said as she looked back to Ritska. "She was the one who cared for children more than I, especially with my own colored past with them." Ash thought that to be a rather clear understatement. "Maybe," he heard Ritska said, "but I know how good you are with clothes as well and your spells are probably the best we have. For what we need, I'd say you are the best person for the job and I trust you on that." There was another pause. Then the witch sighed and shook her head. She stepped over and frowned as her eyes landed on Gina. They sharpened into a razor edge and then moved straight up to him. The frown on her lips deepened further. There was a sudden wave of disapproval and disappointment. Then it vanished. Medea looked back down at the girl and gave her a short once-over. There was a flicker of disgust in her eyes. "I can make do with her," she said, "and getting her cleaned up is a feat so trivial that any mage could accomplish it, or you could find a bath. I believe you did have a god of water accompany you down." Ash felt surprised that he needed to be reminded of that. Surprised and now slightly annoyed. His eyes instantly turned across the deck, seeking out the bright silver arm of Nud. He found him in only a few turns of the head. He was standing at the far side of the deck and speaking with some of the human crew. There was a wide smile on his face. He threw back his head and laughed. "Honestly, that slipped my mind as well," Ritska muttered with embarrassment. There was flush of shame over his cheeks. He coughed, scratching the underside of his chin. "How about I owe you one?" Medea turned, her eyes wide. "Really?" she said. There was a tension in her voice. "That seems risky, master." Ritska shrugged. "I think you can be responsible with a favor. Not like I didn't already owe you one for the other dress." Medea hummed and looked away. "True, very well. I shall see about tending to this one, as long as he doesn't get any more ideas about cutting hair or trimming cloth." She had cast a dismissive wave of the hand in his direction. He thought it strange and rather curious that she already decided he was unfit to cut cloth when all he had done was trim hair. Ahead, there was a shout from across the deck, his head spun around and his body turned with it a fraction of a second later. At the bow of the ship, some 10 or so meters away, there was the vague outline of a man standing and pointing outwards. He was stabbing his arm back and forth, turning around to face them and shouting again. "I can see light in the forest. I can see them." Ritska was moving as he heard the shout. With a short nod for Medea, he started off in a brisk walk. Within a few paces, he was joined by nearly all the servants he had come down with, and not just them. There was a crowd at the bow of the ship when he arrived, just barely wide enough to accommodate them if they crammed in shoulder to shoulder. Ritska squinted down. There was a distance of perhaps 100 meters or maybe more, but he could see the flickers of yellow light in the depths of the wood, the rays of light broken by the dark shadows of the trees standing before it. He could hardly see anything more than the light, but there was no disguising the relief or the joy in the voice of the original caller. Instead he turned, looking around for a second before his eyes found Fionn as he made his own approach. His face was cast in a tense line, his eyes narrowed and his posture stiff. He stopped at the edge of the railing and leaned forwards, moving slightly over the edge of the ship and peered straight ahead. 3 seconds passed, then he pulled back and nodded, the tension easing away and replaced with a smile. "Yes, that is them." Turning, he waved a hand and gestured down. The mast of the ship groaned, the sails let out a long and deep whistle as they turned slowly and steadily, and then the ship started to drop. Ritska once more looked over the railings, watching as the line of trees and dark greenery below started to climb upwards towards them. His eyes moved frantically around and searched for a clearing where they would be landing. But he saw nothing. His frown deepened. "Are we landing or just going to float?" Fionn had turned back to him. "We'll float," he said, nodding his head curtly. "There are few landing spots and it saves time on disembarking." Ritska could imagine a ladder or a large rope net being thrown over the bow of the ship and straight down. He thought of the difficulty with climbing down and then could think only of Ash grabbing Gina and hurling himself and her over the edge and plummeting into the woods below. He frowned at the image, then turned his head. Ash had not joined them at the bow of the ship and had instead remained with Gina, his arms still folded tightly over his chest as Medea weaved her hands. Her voice carried over the breeze, not that he could make sense of any of the words. Ritska moved his eyes back to Ash and watched him intently, keeping note of his posture and his stance. He was staring straight down at Gina, and even with his expression concealed under the helmet, Ritska could almost imagine the narrowed eyes of focus and the slight frown on his lips. If there was one thing that Ash made clear, it was when he was getting annoyed. There was a soft thump, the ship jerked around him and he went completely still. His head turned and his hands moved out, reaching quickly to the railings of the ship and clamping down hard around the rough wooden railings. He winced at the sharp pain in his fingers, turning his hand but couldn't make out anything in the low lighting, yet it felt like splinters. Very quietly, he sighed and shook his head. "Senpai," Mash said behind him. He saw her step forwards in the corner of his eye and then move another few paces until she was situated directly to his right. There was a small glint of polished metal in her right hand and then a flash of bright white light. It was a flashlight. "Ah, thank you," Ritska said, looking down at his hand more clearly until the light and frowning. Already he could see the few splinters that had caught themselves in his palm and in the joints of his fingers, small and thin strips of deep brown wood. Mash quickly reached across and took hold of his wrist, shining the light across it. There was a short moment, then her face twisted in concern and she sighed, turning away from him and looking straight down. "Fu, can you come up and help me, please?" There was a sudden rush of white and then a small furry shape jumped up onto the railings between them and settled down. Fu perched himself quite comfortable and cocked his head, an ear twitched slightly and his tail sharply moved from side to side. There was a curious and questioning gaze in his eyes as he turned his attention almost completely onto Mash. She held out the light towards him. "Could you hold this for me, please?" Fu stared at it for a moment. Ritska knew that Fu was smart, but he struggled to imagine him heeding such a request. At least those were his thoughts. With a soft chirp, Fu nodded his head and then placed a paw onto the flashlight, pressing it down onto the wood and keeping it held firmly in place. With his chest puffed out, he mounted the light and stood atop it. The posture, Ritsuka thought, was strangely similar to the sort he would have seen in picture books. Like that of a lion standing on a rock overlooking its territory, Fu had perched himself on the flashlight, the breeze ruffling his snow-white fur. There was a sharpness to his features, a prideful note in his eyes. Then he winced, looking back down as Mash took his hand and moved some tweezers towards him. "I am glad I packed these," she said. Her voice was quiet but relieved. Ritsuka nodded. "So am I." Once more the ship groaned below him, another soft thumping, and he glanced over, parting his eyes from Mash plucking splinters from his hand. He could make out the tops of the trees, the rising shapes moving towards them, and the thumping grew louder. The movement of the ship slowed until eventually it came to a stop, as did the thumping noise. Though now it was replaced by a different sound, the rustle of the leaves and the distant chatter of animals disturbed by their arrival. "Think that'll be enough for now," Ritsuka said, pulling his hand away from Mash and stepping towards Fyun. "How are we getting down?" Fyun looked at him. Then he smiled. The smile remained, but Ritsuka no longer paid attention to it. Instead he had turned his head over the side, frowning as a new sound approached. It was quiet and distant at first, but now it was growing louder and stronger by the second. He scrunched his face and raked his head for why it sounded similar. Then he cocked his head to one side. It sounded like a tap. Yes, he thought in shock, it sounded just like a running tap. A rush of water, and then from below, the rustle of the leaves grew sharper and heavier. He looked over the edge of the boat, peered down into the darkness and then squinted. There was something moving down there. It was moving quickly as well. The light in the distance was now distorted, stretched and pulled as though viewed through a shifting lens. Ritsuka stared and then felt his eyes start to widen, his lips parted in silent exclamation and a gasp rippled in the back of his throat. He felt his arms raise and his hands place themselves down on the railings once more. Easing himself forwards, Ritsuka leaned down and watched as the distortion gradually started to climb. There was the rush of white along the hull of the boat, perhaps a meter below him, and the bubble of fast swirling water. And it was water. He looked around sharply and saw that surrounding the ship on this side, from the bow to the stern, was a large puddle of water. As though they were floating across the surface of the ocean, the clear liquid rushed alongside them and embraced close to the boat. Then it contracted, dragged right to where he was standing and then pulled upwards. It was close enough to touch. And he did just that. He jerked his body forwards and stretched out his hand, his fingers plunged straight down and then sank into a cold and wet blanket. He yanked back with a rather loud splash, staring with wide eyes at his now damp fingers and then down to the liquid right up to the railings. A short burst of laughter escaped him. "It's cold," he muttered between giggles. Beside him, there was a low muffled sound of laughter. He turned. Fyun held his smile wide and had his arms folded neatly over his chest. There was a certain smug look in his eyes. Ritsuka turned. "Mash," he said, waving his hand without tearing his eyes from the water, "are you seeing this?" There was a hurried thump of footsteps, a flash of dark metal in the corner of his eye mixed with lilac pink. Mash leaned forwards and peered down. The flashlight shone brightly in her hand and he could see the gentle rhythmic waves across the face of the water, the slow movement of the breeze against it. Like the surface of a lake, he thought in astonishment. Except they would still be at least 15 to 20 meters above the ground. The water moved swifter, twisting and pulling sharply as it curled. It dragged down, a whirlpool formed beside the ship but not like any he had seen. An unseen force pulled it straight down and yet it did not pull all the water with it. There was still plenty left behind, a meter in diameter, and moving straight down to the ground below, twisting between the trees and the thick green of the branches. It vanished somewhere out of sight, disappearing into the shadowed leaves. A staircase, Ritsuka saw in shock and amazement. Railings pulled up along the side of the curved and spiraling staircase of water, blocking off the problem of falling and leaking over onto the deck itself. A single step offered leverage over the railings and onto the steps. He took a few paces back and stared at the new staircase in amazement. He turned, waving his hand over. "Gina," he said, the pull of the grin on his lips. "Come and look at this." She was still with Medea, and perhaps he should have specified. Ash took his words as some sort of command as he saw the Avenger move, a sudden and quick movement as he stepped forwards and reached out, picking the girl up with one arm and holding her upright, tucked against his body and with her head facing forwards. Medea, beside them both, went upright and gave a displeased stare, but otherwise did nothing else to show her annoyance. Ritska flinched. Gina looked displeased and wriggled in Ash's hand, then stopped. Her shoulders slumped and her head hung low. Annoyance and resignation made themselves known on her face, and she stared to the ground. He lowered his arm, staring now at Ash as he was stepping closer and closer. It was more of a suggestion," he said. Ash stopped and set the girl down without a word. As soon as she was done, she turned and pulled her hand back, and then she stopped. For a moment, Ritska thought she might have punched him. She stood there with her arm cocked back and her fist raised, but she didn't do anything else. He could see the strain as she stopped herself from moving, then lowered the arm again and gave a low growl, like that of an animal. Her eyes, bright green, turned and looked up towards him and what he was pointing to. There was a short silence, then she stomped forwards and huffed. Her arms rose and then quickly fell crossed over her chest. She was cleaner now. Her bright chestnut brown hair was grown back to a long length for a young girl, stretching about an inch past her shoulder. Her face was soft and rounded, full of youth that placed her at an age near enough Jack, or perhaps a year older. Her clothes, still worn down, were a light beige color and slightly pulled at the corners, but at least were now clear of the old mud and dirty stains that he had seen before. "It's a staircase made of water," Ritska said, jerking his thumb towards it. Gina frowned, then looked at it. She blinked, the anger washed away quickly as she leaned forwards, squinting and staring at it in confusion. It was a treat for him to watch as she gradually came to realize just what she was staring at. Her eyes slowly widened and her mouth dropped open. There was a rush of childish amazement as she pulled back, her hands pulling out from the posture. Gina moved, bounding forwards with several long and hurried steps and right up to the first raised platform of water. She dropped into a crouch, flung out her hand and slapped it hard. There was a splash, the top layer of the water jumped upwards around her hand and dropped. Gina jerked back to her feet and stood up. Like a frightened cat, he thought with a growing smile. His hands slipped into his pockets as he watched her, content as she amused herself with more pokes and prods. Then she took a step forwards, her foot hovering about half an inch from the first step. Very slowly, she lowered it down and pressed her small leather shoe against the step. There was a short pause before her face tightened and she pressed harder, the muscles in her legs tensing as she kicked at it. Swinging her leg up and down as she tried to stomp through the water and down to the deck below. She climbed quickly, now jumping up and down, water splashing as she made a futile attempt. "Guess the safety check is confirmed," Ritska said with small amusement. He looked towards Fyun and just past him. It was easy to spot just over the shoulder of the Lancer, the grinning face of Nud and the puffed-out chest, his hands placed firmly on his hips and his head swinging around, dragging a proud smirk across any who would see it. Ritska rolled his eyes. It was the type of behavior he had come to expect from Nud by now in the short time he had been present. "I'll head on first," Fyun said as he moved towards Gina as she was still jumping up and down on the watery step. His hands gently took her under the arms and moved her to the side. He turned and smiled. "Just so that they know we're all allies." Ritska nodded. It was a fairly smart decision, he thought. With a rather brisk pace, the man descended down with a wet splash of footsteps and then moved out of sight. Ritska hesitated for 2 or 3 seconds, then took the next step upwards and pressed his weight down onto the step. His lip pulled upwards, realizing that he was doing exactly the same thing as Gina barely a handful of moments ago. "Senpai," Mash began. "It's fine," Ritska said, turning to her with a reassuring smile. "It's actually fairly solid. Still," she said, "I think I should go down first." Ritska could read between the lines well enough to know it was less of a suggestion and more of a pleading demand for her to be the first one down. He frowned, but then nodded and stepped back all the same. Her eyes shone bright with relief as she jumped up the steps and then started her rapid pace downwards. There was a short moment of peace, then he felt the sharp pull on the back of his shirt and the weight shoot up his back. He turned at the sudden feeling of warmth against his cheek and found Fu, pressed up in the corner of his neck and staring straight ahead. With 2 taps of the paw, the small animal gestured forwards. "What the heck?" Ritska murmured, brows pinched tightly together. Was he being ordered around like that? It was rather bemusing, he thought. But he gave a short shrug, decided it didn't matter, and then moved up the steps and followed the sound of the wet footprints. As he took the first few steps, he was surprised by how solid it all felt. Though he had gotten a grip of it when he first moved to the step and when he had seen Gina jump up and down, there had been little way of truly coming to feel how sturdy the whole thing was until he was walking down it. It reminded him, vaguely, of the old glass stairwells he had seen but strangely more secured. The ground under him was visible. If he squinted he could make out the branches and the leaves which had been caught in the water itself. Around him, the long arm branches of the trees moved towards him, as though reaching out from the trunks. His hand moved, swatting aside some of the closer ones as he did so and felt a small curl on the corner of his lip. It was quite a bit different, he thought, and no matter how much he saw there was always something new to surprise him. From above and below, the sound of footsteps surrounded him. He chanced a quick glance up and behind and then felt his eyes narrow as his feet briefly stopped. It was a short pause, but enough for him to see the shape above him clearer. There was only one set of footprints overhead, and he was now familiar with the grunting and groaning of Gina struggling. With a sigh, he turned around and waited with arms folded. It was 2 or 3 seconds later that the armored boots of Ash moved out from around the water and into the clear line of sight, swiftly followed by the rest of him, and with one arm raised, Gina tucked against his chest while she scowled tightly and looked thoroughly miserable. "I think she can walk by herself," Ritska said, looking at the helmet. There was a slight pause as Ash cocked his head, like that of a confused animal. Then he shook it. "She is too slow," Ash said, "and she could trip. I presumed you would wish for her to avoid getting more injured." Ritska stared, then raised a brow very slowly. While those were certainly concerns, he would not have called them immediately pressing. "You can put her down now," he said. "I think she can manage the rest of the way on her own." Ash was silent and still for a moment. Then, rather abruptly and without warning, lowered her straight down onto the steps and let go of her. She bounded forwards nearly 2 steps and fell right towards him. Ritska jerked and caught her shoulders with his hands, letting out a soft gasp of surprise as he did so. She flinched and looked up at him. He smiled and turned slightly. "Want to go ahead of me?" Gina was past him before he even finished. Ritska exhaled, then looked back up at Ash, receiving only another tilt of the head. "How do you go from being overprotective to being amazingly careless?" "I don't know what you mean," Ash said. Ritska could tell that much and, with another shake of the head, he turned and resumed walking down the final steps to the ground level. He had the strong feeling this would certainly take a while. "What do you think looking after her means, Ash?" There was a short pause before he got a response. "Ensuring she lives." The answer was about as simple as it could have been and wholly within what he expected of Ash. Decidedly lacking as well. Ritska stopped walking and turned back around, leaning onto the stairwell. "I'm gonna admit that I'm a bit biased," he said slowly. "My friends had little sisters or brothers and I felt kind of protective for them. I guess it's having a soft spot for children." Ash grunted, "And she's been through a lot. Far more than someone her age really should have gone through. I just want to make sure that when this singularity comes to an end, she's got at least a reasonably healthy mind. Even if it won't matter." Ritska shrugged. "By that logic, I shouldn't make friends with anyone because we'll eventually all die. We talked about how people are more than just being anger and rage, right?" Ash nodded, but Ritska could feel the questioning gaze. So he went right ahead. If this singularity ends and Gina remained bitter and angry, with the last memory of her being a kid who knows how to cut throats, would you really be alright with that? I'm asking honestly here. Ash remained both still and silent, the helmet made reading his expression impossible. I don't want an answer right away. Ritska waved a hand. I just want you to think about it, alright? You can keep teaching her, give her something to focus on, but I just want you to think about why. He turned around and walked down, stopping a few steps along the way. Oh, and I thought about what you said for Jack. Ash made a small hum but said nothing. I don't particularly like it either, but I think her fighting to protect her little bit of happiness is better than her killing because she's lonely and sad. There was no forthcoming reply to his words, but he thought that was fine. He might have gotten carried away and expected far too much, or thought too heavily of himself. Not that it was about him. It was about Ash and just giving him the chance to think about what he really wanted out of this. Ash wanted people to love themselves, or near enough. He wasn't sure it was the right path, especially considering where Ash learned that particularly child-rearing talent from. Cycle 563. Day 1. My options are limited. I have repeated cycles and memorized patterns. The patterns repeatedly change in response to my predictions. Despite the repeating series of efforts, the plans differ. I am left with the conclusion that the mastermind can recall the past cycles with the same clarity as I have ceased informing ____ and C__LD of the cycles. Their knowledge does not yield any improvement of the situation, and I tire of explaining it. I shall continue on. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. And please support the author by link in description. Singularity 5. Ta ine Amaric. 8. Well off the rails. Stepping down from the water steps and into the thickly wooded area, Ash narrowed his eyes. Around him, there came the strong sounds of movement, the rustle of branches and the clatter of steps. Further beyond and into the curtain of shadow, he could spy the flicker of lights. They were small and moving infrequently. Lanterns, he thought. With Gina ahead of him, she was casting a worried and anxious glance all around her. She had since stopped her dash from him, leaving herself close to the group and unwilling to move further. He narrowed his eyes behind his helmet, frustrated at her changes. If she was truly so terrified of the darkness of the woods, then sprinting on ahead was perhaps the worst mistake she could have made. Yet she had done so all the same and was now, only just, coming to realize that she had neither protection nor cover, nor did she likely know where she was supposed to go. Ash stopped beside her, frowning deeply. Gina flinched, her shoulders rising in a sharp and jerked motion. Her head turned towards him, eyes rising until they landed on his helmet. Whether she could feel his stare or merely had her own feelings on the matter, she retreated back a pace and lowered her head back down, quickly closing her arms around herself in a tight embrace. With a shake of the head, he stepped around her and moved forwards. Fyun had stopped ahead of them, his back to them and gazing out into the forest. Taking a brief pause, Ash took the seconds to survey his surroundings. Tall trees surrounded them on all sides, and between them, allowing for very little open passages, were woven bushes and shrubs. It was a dark green wall, and while it would do nothing to stop him, he would admit there would be some difficulty in navigation. It all looked the same to him, if he had been here alone. If he turned one way, he would have thought it just the same as any other way. The lanterns deep in the woods, so far that they were glowing specks, were the only source of navigation he had for trekking these woods and little else. Light was dim and barely a factor. The branches curved outwards and formed a blanket overhead. The wide-stretching leaves blocked out most of the moon and stars above their head. It let only thin rays of pale white light drop through into the ground, illuminating some of the greenery while leave the rest as dark shadows. Fyun turned and nodded his head. They are expecting us now, he said, smiling. The good news is that our group seems to have been the only ones to see any combat, the others have evaded them. It was good news, Ash supposed, if they were truly going to be allies. With the only information coming from the man in his group, He did not believe they would get the entire picture of what was happening here. Yet there was no denying they had been attacked and targeted. Which meant that, at the very least, the group affiliated with Londor was adversarial. It was something Ash had already accepted, however. With his eyes still on the blonde lancer, he waited until Ritska had emerged from the corner of his gaze and stepped forwards, head-on by Mash, who had her shield gripped tightly in her hands. "Definitely some good news for you," Ritska said, hands on his hips. "So, what now?" With a hum, the blonde man turned around and pointed to the lights. "They have made camp through there. We need only wait a moment for—" There was a short pause, then a smile. "And there he is." Ash squinted as he felt the rather sudden approach of a servant. He shifted his stance, his eyes narrowing tight. Until the abrupt flash, there had been no warning he would even be staring at a servant. Yet there was merely an instant before he sensed them now. They were approaching at a close distance. An assassin class, he supposed. It would have made sense with their lack of a presence until they were right before him. He heard the trees and bushes rustle, the leaves overhead started swing back and forth, jerking as the branches curved with a low and steady creak. His eyes turned up, squinting at the sight of the shadows turning themselves overhead. Even on the ground the forest seemed to open up. The once thick curtain of shadowed greenery peeled apart, revealing a well-trodden path of churned-up mud and barely visible grass. From beyond that, there was the wet thump of footsteps across the mud. A barely visible figure emerged and into the low lighting of the clearing around them, if it could be called a clearing. It was only as such because it was wide enough for them to stand, but it would have been no more than 4 or 5 meters at the most. Half their number was still on the spiraling steps of water. Into the light stepped forth a man with dark-colored skin and braided locks in his dark hair. Beaten leather trousers and an old brown coat, the man stared at all of them, his eyes softening and nodding his head. "You have arrived, as the spirits told me you would. I am relieved to see that they blessed you well on your journey." Fyun made a short noise of surprise, then a low chuckle. "You offered my fortune to the spirits. Then I am to be rather thankful indeed for our success. We have others who would be fortunate as well. We picked up our quarry with only minimal risk." "So I see," the man said, turning those sharp eyes onto the group. They lingered for a few seconds, moving between each of them long enough to study them, then dropping down to Gina for the longest. His head tilted and he drew himself upright. "I cannot say I recognize you, young miss," the man said, "but I am glad to meet you all the same." Gina, beside him, let out a short and worried noise, stepping back. Ash kept his eyes firmly planted on the man. There was another sense of familiarity with them. It was the face of a person he knew, but was struggling to place. Another name of this land and this era, or close enough to it that it was rousing his memories. His jaw tightened and his teeth ground together. A few more seconds, he mused. A few more and he would have the name. "Which of you is the master?" the man asked, glancing around with a sharper gaze until it stopped. He had found Ritska, Ash concluded. "That would be me," Ritska confirmed a moment later, hand raised and stepping forwards from around Mash. "Neat trick with the forest, by the way. Very nifty." The man let out a low huff. "Nifty, you call it? Perhaps in some way, but I am little more than a vessel for the spirits. I can only ask them for aid and patiently await their response. Yet we did not come for such things and perhaps later." Stepping backwards, he turned and nodded his head for the pathway. "Come, I shall guide you back to our camp and we can rest. I fear that even if you should all stand here, that it has been a long day for you. We have journeyed hard as well and resting together might bring about a tighter friendship." Ash kept himself silent as the man had spoken. His words were diplomatic and his face was reasonably soft. He knew that Ritska would accept the request and use it as a chance to speak with more depth to the group, just as he would enjoy doing so. Yet Ash found his words to be almost naive, or perhaps chaotically optimistic. Bringing a group of strangers to the heart of their camp and then assuming they would all be on the same side was rather risky. Especially as Ash was already somewhat dubious towards them. Ritska could have been as well. Or this group was truly desperate for assistance in whatever way they could grasp it. They had spoken of their own position as tenuous at best and abysmal at worst. Ritska and Mash moved past him, the former giving Gina a soft nudge for her to keep up with the two of them. He took a long step up behind them and fell into a march, the sword in his hand held loosely against his shoulder, his eyes and senses moving beyond and stretching to the thicket. Then, rather quickly, he felt the name click into place. "We are being escorted by Geronimo," Ash said through the mental link. There was a brief pause, perhaps 1 or 2 seconds, then Ritska responded. "Mash, help me out here." Another pause, lesser this time, and Mash quickly filled the silence. "Right, Senpai." Geronimo was a famous Apache war leader during the 19th century. It was in the period when the United States was moving the Apache people into reservations. Geronimo led frequent raids out of such places to return the people to their original lifestyle of being nomads. He was also known as a medicine man within the Badonkohe band, which meant he was a healer. There was another short break. Ash was certain that Ritska, and the others, were digesting the information as it came to them. Mash, however, proved he was not done. He was not strictly a chief of the tribe, however his repeated battles against the United States during the 19th and 20th century meant he was frequently put in charge of large raiding parties. He was also noted to be a shaman, which means that he would likely be a powerful caster servant. Another small pause. Then Ritska have a short nod of the head. So it makes sense that he would be here then. So when he talks about the spirits, he means nature spirits then. Would that make him a bit like Torin and Siu Chalain then? For a few moments, Mash said nothing. Then she hummed, low and thoughtful. It is possible to consider. The role of a druid was not that different from that of a shaman, both held high ranks within their groups and were turned to in times of crisis. Then he would be a powerful ally. Bedrick announced through the link. This woodland is curious indeed, and I could not sense the man until he had appeared before us. Their lack of discovery might well be owed to him. Or a dangerous foe. Ash pointed out with a frown. He felt they were being too hopeful with the situation, and while he would not deny that there was a decent chance this would end with an alliance, he was not going to allow himself to remain ignorant to the alternative. If they were walking into a trap, then being in the woodlands with a man who could commune with the spirits made this his natural territory. Especially if he had already received the chance to prepare it prior to their arrival. Which clearly he had. I would advise caution. MMMMMH. Yeah. Ahead of him, he could see Ritska nod his head up and down. I'll see what these guys have to say and meet the rest of the team. Though I still want to see what is up with these other groups and what their aims are. There was a soft groan. Ritska slowly shook his head from side to side, turning and looking quickly over his shoulder. This already sounds like another Rome situation, he said, grimly. Which means we'd need an army if we hope to win. If both sides turn out to be dangerous, then we're in a really bad spot. Ash frowned deeply. He was considering that as well. It brought his thoughts to himself and that of his allies. By the rate of a heroic spirit, they should have been capable of fending off the armies they had fought in life. Their noble phantasms could be ranked within the realm of anti-army and even beyond such things. He held a noble phantasm that would have been regarded as one such. In fact, he held many of them. Yet reality and theory were different. Yet he knew little of the enemy's capacity. They had fought Arjuna, a servant whose power was certainly enough that Ash himself would warrant them as a considerable threat with their noble phantasm. They had the sword of Fyun. Even this version of Siu Chalain seemed considerably stronger than his other selves, and despite this, the group was still slanted as being the lesser in the grand scheme. Was the value of an army truly so great when compared with quality? It was not a question that took long to answer. Ash understood the value of determination and sheer scale of effort beyond the quality of a warrior. If enough bodies were hurled upon the blades, they would eventually make a mistake and be cut down. Sooner or later, it would happen to even the best among their number, and he knew not how many soldiers could be fielded. The woods ahead of them started to thin as his thoughts swirled. It drew him slowly back from those deep considerations as, one by one, he felt the number of servants within his range increase. It was a rather sudden climb, enough that he was given pause. For a moment, he could draw a startling comparison with the feeling of entering the halls of Chaldea and being surrounded at all sides by heroic spirits of varying legends and status. Even their strength varied as such, his eyes narrowed and he drew himself taller and his posture grew tighter. The hold of his sword pulled the blade across from his shoulders and down to his side. A trap felt possible now, far more so than earlier. Ash heard only the soft crunch of old leaves underfoot, the gentle rustle of folding branches as their path continued onwards. Yet above that noise, there was a new sound introduced. One that had him strain his focus to the very edge, yet it was a requirement for barely a few moments at best. The sounds blended together and then drowned one another out. The rush of different conversations formed a confusing mess that he struggled to differentiate between. As they passed through the final gap in the trees and the last of the bushes cleared open the path, he peered above the heads of Mash and Ritska, then past the shoulders of Geronimo and Fyun. Before them was a clearing, a large swath of grassland surrounded at all sides by the towering shadow of the trees. Yet where their original landing was shadowed under branches and barely graced with the thin rays of moonlight, this place was cast under the pale hue of the stars above. Like a spotlight, Ash thought mutely, his eyes narrowed as he took in every detail as quickly as he possibly could. The number of servants was high. Much higher than he could have anticipated. It took him only a moment to count them all, and when he finished, the frown he wore under his helmet grew deeper. His head turned to each of them, cycling through their faces and quickly attaching names to each and every one of them. With the inclusion of the servants they had arrived with, the total was brought to 12. Without Chaldea's presence, that was. Ash could understand they were outnumbered. Yet he noticed something more. There was a distinct lack of attention brought to the sudden arrival of Chaldea, rather it was as if the group mattered very little. That understanding came to him slowly, his brows knit together and sword held at the ready. He stopped and he stared. Waiting for the moment in which they would be cast under the concentrated gaze of the entire field of servants under the shadow of the floating ships. Yet it did not happen. Those ships, much like the one they had arrived in, hovered over them and dropped deep in covering dark shadows upon the clearing. It was the only spot of darkness to be found in the night. Under them he could see the movement of dozens of humans of varying genders and ages. Some were old, most were young, and there was barely a distinction in the number of men and women who were busying themselves with a narrow field of tasks. Most related to the movement of crates or the setting up of tents and sleeping bags. Ah! From across the came, there was a sudden and high-pitched shout of delight. He turned quickly, setting his eyes on a woman with bright pink hair and clothed with a snow-white furred cloak. She had her eyes on their group, or, more specifically, on Cu Chulainn himself, rather than any one of them. As if they did not matter, or rather that they mattered less to this woman. Ash stared for a short moment longer, his head cocked slowly to one side as the woman rapidly approached, giving them not even a passing glance, nor even that of Fyun or Geronimo as she all but skipped towards them, smiling with bright white teeth all the while, her eyes almost glowing with delight. It was an enthusiasm which had him rather surprised. Then he found the name for the face and felt his body go tense and rigid. Medby. See you. You're back. She cheered, sliding before the taller servant and uncaring for the complete lack of a meaningful response or acknowledgement he gave. Rather, the man had kept on walking and merely shouldered past her as she approached. Oh, still so cold to me, see you, but that's all right. That cold shoulder of yours makes me shudder. Ash was sure that he blinked. The unease he felt became lost rather quickly under the confusion that now emerged. He was quite sure he had heard her speak correctly, yet the words did not make sense. What he understood of the legend was that Cu Chulainn and Medby had become enemies. It was her own armies which had brought about his death. Yet here she was, excitedly welcoming him back to the camp as though they shared a more intimate and special connection. At least Cu Chulainn's apathy made sense to him. Huh. From beside him, there was a bemused noise. Nud took a step into the corner of his gaze. The blond man had his eyes narrowed in suspicion and his arms folded over his chest neatly. He was scrutinizing the image before him, Ash determined rather quickly. And whatever he saw, he decided it was not quite something he approved of. Medby is being a bit more friendly to Luff's boy than I would have thought. Personal matters, Ash thought, and clearly they had been here a while. Perhaps his altered state is more agreeable with her. Ash suggested with a brief shrug, his eyes lingering on the back of the servant in question. He displayed only tired disinterest, rather than annoyance or hostility. It could possibly mean that he felt nothing for Medby, whether that was affection or dislike. If she preferred that apathy, and if Cu was content with her actions, then he had no reason to care. Even if he personally found it bemusing. Folding his arms, Ash looked away from the display of public affection and instead cast a long and scrutinous glance upon the other servants that surrounded them. Most making their way over, slow and measured and in no real hurry. He recognized them very gradually, their faces were distinct enough. And he had met some of them before. One in particular caught his gaze, just as he thought it would catch both Ritska and Mash. As expected, the servant in question was barely more than a few steps closer before there came twin shouts. Oscar! Sir Oscar! The knight almost tripped over, stumbling over his own feet and barely catching himself. Jerking backwards with raised shoulders, the man made his surprise evident even with the helmet covering his face. It was a simple matter to imagine the wide-eyed look of shock and confusion from the way he stood. Nearly a fraction of a second later, both Ritska and Mash were making their way over to him. Ahead, Fyun turned about and let loose a small whistle of surprise. Oh, so you are quite a bit more famous. With a teasing lit to his voice, one that reminded Ash somewhat of Nud, the Lancer smiled and folded his arms, motioning with his hand to the pair. I had to tell them who I was and you need only make an appearance. Goodness, some might have been rather jealous about that. What? But I don't. Oscar stumbled over his words, head swinging back and forth between the duo that were now crowding in front of him and the Lancer. There was a rush of steps, as that Sir Oscar the first here. And with that, and another flurry of hurried heavy steps, Bedrick paced right by his shoulder and was the third to come crowding to the man. The sudden arrival of the Lord of Cinder was evidently the last straw for Oscar. The man reeled back, throwing up his hands and sputtering out a drowned wave of words. Ash cocked his head and raised a brow. I believe they might overwhelm the poor fellow. Fyun remarked, still with a light note of mischief. Maybe. Ash said, nodding slowly. It would be of little surprise for him if they did so, but he was unwilling to advance or interrupt. Oscar had proven a reliable ally in the short time they knew him, and without his assistance, the third singularity would have been far more difficult. The presence of the Lord Vessel and the role he played in holding back the Argonauts with the assistance of Asterios provided them valuable time. HMPH. There was a drawn-out and puzzled hum, his eyes flicked across. Medby had turned from Cu, her hand resting on her chin and her eyes narrowed slightly. There was puzzlement clear on her face. What are they all doing crowding around him? She said, lowering the finger from her chin and returning it to beneath the furred cloak. Her posture shifted and her head cocked slightly to one side. Ash saw no reason to interrupt or explain. Instead, he turned to the small girl who was now beside him, lingering closer to Nud, and then looked around. Gina. He said he heard her gasp and the sudden jerked rustle of clothes. Come, we are searching for a stick. Right now? She asked. She sounded tired. Ash turned back and peered down at her. She looked tired as well, he thought. There were thick and darkening bags under her eyes, her cheeks were slowly starting to sink and her posture was loose and clumsy. He watched her, then nodded. The sooner you find a stick, the sooner you can rest. Ash declared, folding his arms and narrowing his gaze. With a groan of annoyance, the girl stomped her feet and walked past him, glaring to the ground the whole time she did so. She would probably overlook things, he thought, with all that anger in her face. He would go through the same problem when he was frustrated or annoyed. With time, she would learn. So many servants. He heard the director say behind him. Romani glanced at the reflection. He could see her, hand raised to her mouth and teeth biting into her thumbnail. Her eyes were drawn narrow and a moment later, her head turned away. Romani looked back to the screen. She was quite right. There were 10 already present. Excluding the ones that Ritska had brought down with him. A force of so many servants, and with all that, apparently they were still the weakest group out here. Not even for lack of power either, which was worrying. The likes of Fyun, Siyu Chilane and even Medby were among the highest and most famous servants out there. Perhaps not the most famous, but certainly in the case of Fyun. The scope of his legend alone would put him in the same pedestal as King Arthur as far as servants went. Yet they were losing. And Arjuna as well, they had said he had been killed earlier. Romani brought his hand to his chin, rubbing under and around his throat as he bit down on his lip. This was already seeming to be a rather underdog situation before Chaldea had even arrived, and with everything else that was going on, the sheer organized scale of the enemy forces that had been seen, the fleet of flying ships and wyvern riders that had attacked Chaldea. The saber servant who fought Ash as well. It was worrying, exceedingly so. What the heck? He heard the exclamation come from across the room. It was Carrie. Romani turned, already wearing a confused frown as he spotted the woman leaning forwards into her monitor. Then, much to his surprise, she reached up and tapped the screen twice like it would somehow fix the problem. She lowered the hand back down and shook her head. "What is the problem?" Olga said, her voice quick and sharp. Carrie turned about, her head raised. Her brows were scrunched up tight and her lips were pulled into a puzzled and rather concerned frown. "Well, it's the reading here," she said, motioning to the screen. "We have all the stuff for the length of contracts with Chaldea and all that, but it's super weird at the moment." Romani cocked a brow and felt a bead of sweat drip down the back of his neck. Something being super weird in Chaldea was always a nice little way of saying it was very bad. "I want a more in-depth explanation than just, super weird," Olga said. Her voice grew sharper, as did her features. Carrie shrugged. "I'm not sure what to tell you. It doesn't make a lick of sense to me. According to this, the contract between Ritska and Ash has been operating for..." Quickly, she turned around and stared at the screen. A moment later, her incredulous voice echoed out. 437 years and 5 months. Silence fell upon the room. It was such a silence that a pin could have dropped with the force of a gunshot. Broken only by a cracked and incredulous, "What?" from the director. Carrie whirled back around in her chair, her shoulders jerked up and she frowned. "That's what I mean. It doesn't make sense." "Then find out how it can make sense." Olga snapped back, throwing a pointed finger the way of the woman. "He's obviously not been down there for 400 years. It's like one problem after another with this equipment sometimes." The latter was an irritated groan. The woman turned and dropped her head into her hands. Romani could feel some sympathy for her, but turned his eyes towards Carrie as she scowled and shook her head. A slow turn of the chair and she was back to the monitor, hunched forwards and more than likely thinking and saying some rather annoyed words under her breath. Not that he couldn't understand. It was rather important for everything to be working. Romani turned his eyes back to the screen and leaned forwards, staring at the ongoing livestream of the away team, frowning slightly and cocking his head as his eyes went to the one with Ash and the little girl. There were applauding steps, and then he could see Olga's reflection right behind him. He prided himself on not jerking in surprise when she silently appeared over his shoulder. "What is Fujimaru doing?" Olga grumbled quietly. He shared her worry, but perhaps he could see the method. Romani leaned back, his eyes narrowing in thought. If he was right, then it was certainly risky, but then it would also help out. Ash had already said he disapproved of Mash and what happened with her, and he was quite right to do so. Perhaps what Fujimaru was hoping for was a sudden sense of self-reflection as this continued. "People can probably only be told so many things," Romani said, turning his chair and his neck about to face the director. She sent him a rather bemused stare. "I mean, Ash needs to see some things for himself, right? I think this is one of those things where he needs to see what the problems really are for himself rather than being told. I guess it's just hard to explain, but I think Fujimaru is giving him a chance to be better." Olga stared at him, slowly raising a brow. I meant, what is he doing at the moment?" Romani blinked very quickly, then turned his neck about to the screen once more, His eyes cycled through the images until he found the point of view from Fujimaru and Mash. Very quickly, he rolled his lips inwards to hide the rather embarrassed noise that he was sure that he would make. "Oh, that," he said. Then he cocked his head. "I think he's telling Oscar all about the third singularity. Doesn't seem as though he remembers what happened. He could have actually already been summoned out here before that even kicked off, to be honest." There was a short and accepting grunt, and then she folded her arms. From behind him, there was a sudden thump of the door opening and the heavy steps of metal boots. Romani had just enough time to turn around before he leaned back as the bored face of Mordred swung into the doorway and stared out across the room, her eyes narrowed and her brows pulled tight together. "Anything good happen yet?" she asked, striding into the room. Olga tightly closed her eyes, turned her head upwards and stared to the ceiling for a moment. Romani could imagine her mentally counting down from 10. The head lowered, and she turned back around, facing the knight and placing her hands on her hips. "We are trying to conduct a serious operation here." "Yeah, so," Mordred interrupted, squinting. "You think I can't be serious? I was a knight of King Arthur and the Round Table. I can be super serious." And like that, she was suddenly shouldering her way right towards his screen, dropping her hands on his desk with a rather heavy clank of metal and hunched forwards, glaring hard to the computer and the images, her lips pulled into a tight frown of utter focus. Looking over her shoulder, all Romani found himself able to do was shrug. He didn't understand what was happening either. "Man," Mordred said, shaking her head and leaning back. It had been perhaps 10 seconds since she had first started staring. "This is boring as hell." Olga's eye twitched rather violently, and for once, it was not aimed at Romani. A fact he would have been more thankful if it was not aimed at the somewhat powerful and perhaps a tad aggressive servants who was within arm's reach of him. "Were you expecting a cooking show?" Olga snapped, pointing to the screen. "We're in the middle of some rather important talks. And that was when Drake had me clean out the cabin, and I swear that there was something living in that place. I never saw it, but I definitely heard and smelled it." The quick comment over the line by Fujimaru brought about a short and rather weighty silence. Olga remained with her hand outstretched and pointed to the screen, then it started to lower until thudded quietly by her side. She looked defeated. Mordred looked rather amused, giving a short sniff and leaning back, her arms folded over her chest, and she looked around the room with a rapidly growing smirk. "Seems like you guys are doing some real important works." "Depends on the mood," Carrie said across the room. She laughed a moment later. "Least we ain't got King Arthur moonlighting as Santa." Romani winced. Bringing up King Arthur with Mordred around would only lead to one thing. "What?" "That." As expected, Mordred immediately swung her head about and bore a rather fierce and focused look directly onto Carrie. Romani raised his head towards her, seeing her lean back into her chair, her eyes blown wide and her mouth slightly agape. The sudden pressure clearly got to her. At least it wasn't him. And then Mordred was looking at him. "Did you know about this?" Romani pursed his lips. Then he said the only thing that he could think of. The director was her elf. And like that, Mordred stopped looking at him. And the director was fixing him with a glare that would have stripped the paint off the walls. He could give only a strained smile, his eyes flicking back to the screen and hoping that there would be something happening that he could use to distract everyone. Thankfully, there was. "Oh look," Romani quickly said, pointing to the screen. His voice was loud and silenced the room from the conversation probably about to happen. "They are having a meeting. Best listen to this. Let me just crank up the speakers for us." Hopefully it would make the director less likely to get mad with him when he just saved them all. Or, at the very least, delayed the inevitable conversation that was bound to spring up about it. He grimaced at the thought, then quickly shook his head. Leaning forwards, he pursed his lips and cleared his throat to speak. "He is ready for you." Karna watched the man intently as he sat down on the bench. There was a short pause as his words settled. Then, gradually, the dark-cloaked figure eased themselves up from the waiting chair and started forwards. It was a slow and casual walk. Too casual. Karna noticed, then and there, what had been bothering him rather mutely since the time this man first stepped foot in this building. since he had led them here at the offer of a meeting with President. From the way the man walked to the way he carried himself, to the way he stopped and did not even so much as twitch when the crashing and banging, when the distant sound of gun and cannons rang out. He could finally put it into clear thoughts. This man walked with practice through these halls, as if he had done so 100 times before. Soon, Karna found himself being led rather than the other way around. His eyes narrowed and his lip quirked down. The longer he gazed, the more he noticed the subtle nature in the posture. Exhaustion. His eyes could see it clearly. There was an exhaustion that could come only through conflict. Karna saw it. He saw the same tired nature in the hearts of men who would walk away from a battle one day and then right back into another the next. The eyes of men who knew the inevitable would be violence and dreamed only of the world beyond the clashing of swords and the rain of arrows. Where the flames that burned were in the homes to warm families and not of the homes to cast deep shadows of violence. Yet he owed this man his life. He had been saved by them during the latest skirmish with the Londor kingdom and their servants. It had been a near defeat after the use of his noble phantasm, and were it not for the timing of this man. Karna frowned for a brief moment. The timing worried him also. It had been perfect. Far be it from him to scoff at the kindness of strangers and to smack the hand of the one who offered them up from the ground, but he was wary about just how coincidental it all was. Yet perhaps it was little more than an odd paranoia. The treacherous whispers of one who had been fighting man and woman of different eras for many months now and had seen all walks of servants. Had thought that all the warriors had taken to the stage. Yet there were chances to be surprised. So they walked. It was no more than a minute of striding down the corridor, only 3 paces behind the man he was supposed to be escorting, until they arrived at the doors to the private room of the president. Beside the polished oak doors stood the tall and gleaming figures of 2 automaton guards. Yet, as with the training yard, the man gave them not even a glance as he approached the door and raised his hand. Karna saw a brief flick of hesitation. Not of nervousness, but of something else. For a moment, and only a moment, he suspected the man would have merely thrown open the doors. The hesitation served as a reminder for them to close the raised hand to a fist and knock heavily upon the oak. The loud and thundering noise dominated the hallways for a moment before the silence settled. As the man lowered down the hand, there came the booming call from beyond the door. "Enter." And with that, the man placed his hand on the wood and pushed the door inwards. The president's chamber was, as always, clearly polished and immaculate. With the carpet embroidered with the powerful image of an eagle and without a speck of dust. Karna had long suspected there was a group dedicated for cleaning and that alone, but he was not here often enough to confirm such things. Across the brightly lit room and behind a large curved desk, there was the bright blue and red uniform of the president. His wide and broad frame and tight suit showcased the impressive musculature, and atop the wide-shouldered body there was the fierce and distinct face of the man. He was long accustomed to even the most ardent supporters showing brief surprise. Yet this servant's response was curious. In that there was no response. There was no ounce of surprise or even bemusement. It was the same calm and collected feeling he had received from them the moment they first stepped foot into this building and requested an audience with the president. An audience they would have most certainly have received either way, but Karna now thought they were upholding procedure. He could respect the dedication to such things. As for the president, he leaned forwards. The bright sapphire blue eyes narrowed, the fanged maw curled into a curious frown, and the man drew tight the thick and bushy white brows. "So, you are the one who provided assistance to my forces, are you?" The servant responded with only a single nod of the head. The president came to rest his hands on the desk, the fingers drumming up and down, marking the passing of seconds. 12 beats later, he spoke once more. "Then I appear to owe you something of a debt, my good sir. I understand there was quite the predicament before you arrived. Your actions have saved us quite a bit of trouble and brought victory all the closer." The servant twitched. It was slight. It was perhaps nearly impossible to catch. The president himself certainly missed it. Karna, however, did not. "Victory is no closer to you now than when this war was conducted against Medbi and her forces." The voice was worn down, tired. It matched the way the man carried himself. The president evidently found the words displeasing, though he made little effort to show that unease. The frown remained and his head tilted, the intrigue remained as he raised a very shallow brow. You truly think so? Then perhaps you might enlighten me, sir, why you would aid such a doomed force if you truly believe we have no chance. I said no such thing. Came the quick response, only that you were no closer to victory. The president leaned back, his hands coming to rest atop his lap. Until you arrive, perhaps. There was a layer of amusement in the voice of the president and, perhaps, something far more focused than Karna had seen from the man since this summoning first began. For a moment, the man was rather more human. If there was a thing to call it, Karna would have described what he saw as nostalgia. Do you mean to sell your services, sir? The servant, rather slowly, shook his head. My services won't change the outcome. I am not here to fight your war for you, nor am I here to share your goals. A blunt declaration. Karna appreciated the honesty, however. He gave the smallest of nods when the eyes of the president flicked to him. The servant had spoken the truth and only the truth since he first walked through those doors. They held little interest in the conflict at all, but this made his intervention all the more curious. Not to mention the demand for an audience as well. If his goal was to pay no interest in the war, then his means of going about it could not have been more opposite. You aided us all the same. The president gave a low and thoughtful hum. Rather curious, is it not? Not for me, the servant said. I came only to tell you to stay away from Chaldea unless you mean to work with them. The president raised a brow high. Chaldea. I cannot say I am familiar with this group. Are they a party of yours, perhaps? A new faction thrown into this war. Yes, the servant said. I do not have time to waste, so I will make it quick. They are not your enemy. At the moment, they ally with the resistance, but their goal will always be the kingdom of Londor. The president chuckled. Ah, I see. The resistance have proven to be quite the problem to both factions, but I am amenable to issuing pardons if that will not be necessary. The interruption was both sudden and exhausted. Karna would liken it to a man tired of hearing the same speech over and over. But the president frowned, his eyes narrowed a fraction and his face tensed. The servant, however, gave no reaction to this change and continued. Neither Chaldea nor the resistance will ally with you, and your personal victory is impossible. Abandon your plan and focus on instead saving humanity from the incineration. That is your only path to find tomorrow, rather than yesterday. You know quite a bit. Not enough. The servant said, and Karna could see how truly worn down those words were. Like spoken rust. And with that, the servant turned and started for the door once more. He paused only 2 steps, then turned once more. Only instead of facing the president, he faced Karna. Londor has 3 targets. You are one of them. They failed today but will try again tomorrow. They will target Chaldea as well. Karna, very slowly, raised a brow. Then nodded his head. I see. You speak of it in a more broad way than simply being a powerful adversary. I thank you for this information. His words garnered only a tired grunt. I will be unlikely to change anything, so save your thanks. We will meet again. The president called out. Might I ask for a name, good sir? If you are certain we shall meet again, I would prefer to know the name of the man who would come for another meeting. Certainly, if you have a change of heart. Very slowly, the servant turned their head and stared over their shoulder. It was a gaze that stretched for hours, or felt as such. Sisyphus. The servant said. Karna knew it was a false name from before the words were even uttered, but there was another feeling present also within the heart of this servant. A twisted irony or perhaps even a dark humor in the name. An unfunny joke, as it were. Yet, Sisyphus gave no further words and moved for the door, swinging it open and stepping through without even another twitch. His echoing steps receded into the distance. Karna turned his head about, focusing on the president. He had leaned forwards, his arms raised and steepled under his chin while his eyes remained fixed on the doors. What a curious fellow. President Edison said, and of all the names, why that one? Karna inclined his head, saying nothing but offering agreement. President Edison gave yet another drawn-out and thoughtful hum, then turned his eyes back to the desk. Well, we have a war to fight, and if that man's words have any truth, you might well be a target for some unknown reason. Though it could always be a misdirection, I suppose, but it seems more than a little convoluted for such a thing. He snapped his fingers. Tell Helena I want to see her, and Vice President Noble as well, if you would be so kind. Ritska could have gone a little far in a couple places. He probably had. From the way that Oscar had very purposefully kept a rather far distance from them as they all gathered round, it was clear the man was still a little off-kilter about the whole thing. It was his bad, he knew. But seeing the man again since the third singularity, Ritska had just gone a little overboard with wanting to speak with them. He had never gotten the chance to thank them and, rather unfortunately, they had not yet arrived to Chaldea. So upon seeing Oscar again, he had felt a little overwhelmed. Mash clearly felt the same, considering she had been right there beside him bombarding the man with thanks. Thanks he knew nothing about. It was probably Bedrick rushing over as well that put the final nail in the coffin for how overwhelmed the man really was. For a few seconds, Ritska was genuinely worried the man was about to faint. He did not, thankfully. But here they all were, gathered around a rather large campfire. The number of servants present was something of a surprise and, in Ritska's own view, a little intimidating as well. The number of them was already approaching a dozen and apparently they were still in a bad spot. That worried him. If we are all ready. Fyun began, stepping into the light of the campfire, his face set into a deep and focused frown. Then we might begin with introductions. I have already explained the basics of the situation to the Chaldeans who have arrived to aid us, and I have heard news from the other groups. It seems we were indeed fortunate to have avoided any attacks. For the most part, Ritska recognized the grumble as belonging to Robin. A quick eye was flicked the way of the green man, his arms folded over his chest and his head hanging low. Leaning against a tree in the shadows, he was just barely out of sight from the main focus of the meeting. Though, at least, still present. Fyun chuckled, yes, quite. Still, we have walked away without casualty, which is a rather blessed encounter. Clearly proof that our luck has started to turn, or I shall say so to raise hope for our situation. The good cheer faded quickly, the arms of the man folded neatly over his chest. The bright blue eyes fell upon him and remained. Ritska recognized the gesture for what it was. So he stepped forwards and cleared his throat. Doing this time and time again, he became rather used to public speaking. At least since the last fiasco in Rome. He could see that in his nightmares sometimes, the fumbled effort at public speaking and the loud argument that had taken place behind him. He was rather keen to avoid such a mishap this time, and he very much doubted it could happen twice in a row. Hello. He started, raising his hand and waving. My name is Ritska Fujimaru, I'm from a group called Chaldea. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. We're mages, most of us, at least, who are basically here to help. He let the words settle, his eyes moved past the servants to the crowd of people just behind them. Most looked rather impassive, one or two looked a little relieved. If he was to have a guess, Ritska thought the majority would be a little suspicious. Most of you are probably thinking this is rather convenient for you, and I won't lie, it probably is. Fact of the matter is that we share a common goal, which is putting a stop to both the USEP and the Kingdom of Londor. To that end, we will help you all to the best of our abilities. Slowly crossing his arms, he nodded his head up and down. To him, this felt rather well so far. We have a few different people helping us, so if you see someone new and rather odd looking, they are probably working with us. So there's no reason to be alarmed. We'll be here to help. Another short and drawn-out silence. Any questions? He was surprised to not be immediately bombarded. Then someone far back shouted. Why? Ritska turned his eyes, looking for the speaker, but couldn't find them. All the same, he pointed in the vague direction of the shout. Good question. He called back, then addressed the crowd once more. Basically, if either Londor or the USEP end up winning, then it's going to be a rather bad situation for us at Chaldea. Well, certainly for the Kingdom of Londor, considering they ambushed us when we arrived. His hands came down to his hips. This would probably be the part where some people became upset. He figured there was a reason they were part of a resistance. And not affiliated with the USEP. But I will not lie to you. As we, at Chaldea, have not yet been attacked by the USEP, we're considering them neutral to us at the moment. He raised his hands. That being said, if they also have goals that are directly contradictory to our own, then we are probably going to come to blows with them. It would all depend on whether they would be willing to meet with us. The hands came back down. Much to his surprise, there were no jeers or shouts of fury. Just a long and eerie silence. Another shout. So, what about us? The voice of the man echoed, are you gonna fight us if we don't work with you? Ritska anticipated that one as well. He frowned, lips pursing. I don't want it to come to that. He admitted, seeing no reason to lie to them. And I don't think it would, but we believe Londor is in possession of a very powerful item, and if your group was to try and claim that for your own agenda, then we would oppose you as well. There were murmurs now, low and wary. Ritska let them carry on, just to get their words out. Then he raised his voice. I know you probably don't have reason to trust us at the moment, but I am hoping to change that. Believe us when we say we have experience with this sort of thing before. The guy who handed out these items, he did so with only one goal in mind. Whatever you hope to achieve with them will end badly. It is a tool of the devil. That shout was louder and rather horrified. Ritska blinked, turning and looking off to where he heard the call. He has demons working for him, but it's not the devil. They fight demons. There was another shout, that of a rather horrified woman. We are truly facing the forces of Satan. Ritska shouted, it's not Satan. We're not fighting Satan. He's still a bad guy, but he's not Satan. He just works with demons. Demons. Someone coughed beside him. Ritska was aware of the difference, but he doubted that these people, now panicked as they were, would really listen much to him. The point is that these things are basically cursed. That's an easy way to explain it. They are cursed items and we are trying to get rid of them so that your lives can go back to the way they were before. At least this time no one was shouting, Ritska thought with some relief. Fyun spoke next. If I had any doubts about their intentions, he turned to the crowd, his voice loud and confident. A confidence Ritska could only dream of having. Immediately, he felt like he had been rather awkward the moment Fyun started to speak. Then again, it was likely just the difference in experience between the two of them. Fyun was a king and Ritska was not. I would never have brought them here. Rest assured, the Chaldeans will not cause us harm. We all have our common enemies. Fyun returned the gaze to him, smiling and giving a reassuring nod. It worked, at least. Ritska felt a little more at ease with the vote of confidence. I cannot vouch for the ones here. Oscar suddenly said, his voice tight and wary. A little uncertain as well. Actually, it reminded Ritska of his own speech. The knight kept his arms tightly crossed over his chest, his head hunched low and his shoulders raised high. But I know the quality of character of Lord Bedrick. I do not believe that he would ever work with those who were dishonorable or would inflict the same cruelty you have all been subject to. The people looked more reassured. Still a little tense and wary, some of them, but for the most part they looked a bit calmer. Ritska felt a brief sigh of relief. We have had a long and busy day. Fyun said, turning and waving a hand, let us retire for the evening. We shall need to awaken bright and early for tomorrow. Then he turned and looked at Oscar. Oscar, who kept silent for at least 10 seconds before coughing and jerking about. Of course. He nodded, rather awkwardly at that, and raised a hand. Standard watch formations and rotating every hour. We moved at first light, as you all were. And then he rather hurriedly turned and almost sprinted away and towards a tent. Ritska watched him go, brows climbing high up his forehead, and then turned to Mash. It seemed to him that Oscar held quite the position here. Mash looked troubled, a little worried as well. Do you think we might have been too excited, Senpei? She asked, her voice thick with concern and apprehension. Ritska sighed, maybe a little, I sort of hoped he might remember but I guess he didn't. Quote. I thought that might be the case. The dejection in her voice was apparent. He is an allied servant. A screen flashed up beside him. Ritska turned and was met by the faces of both Olga and Romani. Further surprising was the face of Mordred right behind the pair. She looked a little thoughtful. Or, at least, that is what he thought she would look like when thoughtful. Her face was deeply scrunched up. The director continued, so I see no reason why you cannot form a cordial working relationship a second time. That is, after all, a talent of yours. Mash perked up a little. Right, of course, director. I am certain that Sir Oscar will be a great help to us once again. MMMMH. The director nodded. In the meantime, it would be wise for you to take the advice and have a rest. Your initial arrival was rather difficult. I suspect you will want some time to recover. Ritska was admittedly a little tired. The rush of the day was catching up. As well as everything else. A few hours to breathe would be appreciated, he thought. Right. He nodded. I'll go around and talk. Get people accustomed to friendly Chaldea and all that. And he just felt like talking for a bit. Just to clear his head. Cycle 563. Day 5. __ and her family are dead. They were never recovered. The resistance were attacked and N__ing_ was taken. I have observed the targeting of the berserker and have come to the conclusion that she is essential for some method. Her spirit core is routinely harvested. I shall observe others. For more thrilling fanfiction stories like this, check out my channel Fanfic Audiobook. Dive into epic adventures, mysterious realms, and legendary journeys brought to life through immersive storytelling. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing audiobooks.